Hello, this is Julie Lerman. Welcome back to Entity Framework Core Fundamentals. This module will dive more deeply into tracking and saving data with EF Core. We'll start by digging into a deeper understanding of the DB context and entity with respect to EF Core's tracking. Then, like with the querying module, I'll provide you with an overview of EF Core's tracking and saving workflow to empower you with a better understanding of what EF Core is doing on your behalf. Then you'll learn the basics of inserting, updating, and deleting data using EF Core, and the data model that we created earlier along with the SQL Server database. We'll continue our focus of working with simple types with these early lessons. Then you'll learn about tracking and saving multiple objects at a time, so for example, a handful of authors. You'll learn about EF Core support for bulk operations, which enhances performance when you're saving a bunch of data. Along the way, I'll provide some insight into how persistence is different in disconnected apps like web applications. I'll continue to use the SQL Profiler to provide you with some insight into the SQL that EF Core is sending to the database. So let's get started. I've already mentioned tracking a few times in the earlier modules. It's time to get a better idea of what that is and how it relates to saving. I found that in my years of working with EF and EF Core, understanding this has made life a lot easier, especially when things don't work the way you expect. Learning this early on will make you much more productive, and it will hopefully avoid a lot of the "but why" and "but how" questions you might have as we move forward. The documentation's definition of the DB context is that it is a representation of a session with a database. And that session begins not when the context is instantiated, but the first time you ask the context to do something with the database, execute a query or save some data. But the DB context does more than just interact with the database, and its change tracker is a critical piece of that. I've talked about the little tracker objects already, and they're called entity entry objects. And it's the change tracker that manages them. It creates them and maintains their value. It's the entity entries that know about the state of your domain object. And in more advanced use cases, you can actually interact with those entity entry objects, but you shouldn't need much more insight into them right now. Now I think it will make sense for me to finally explain what an entity is. Entity is one of those overloaded terms that's used throughout software and in a lot of other industries. But within the context of EF Core, it does have a particular meaning. A running application has objects in memory that you're working with. When the DB context is aware of one of those objects, in other words, it has had some reason to create one of those entity entry change tracker objects, then we refer to that in-memory object as an entity. There's another critical aspect of an object required for it to be an entity and for EF Core to be able to track it. It must have a key property. Recall the author has one called ID, and the book has one called book ID. That identity property is pretty important for storing data in the database so that you can identify one from another. And terminology is important. So when I'm talking about an entity, I'm talking about an in-memory object with a key that the DB context change tracker is aware of. The DB context isn't literally managing your domain objects like the authors and books. It just takes a look at them and puts relevant info into those entity entry objects. Now let's look at how DB context keeps track of an entity. An entity is tracked once EF Core has had some reason to create a tracking object for it. You've seen that one of those reasons is when it's tracking the results of a query. The state property of entity entry has a set of enums. The default state is unchanged, which represents when the context first became aware of the entity. In other words, since we met, nothing has changed. There are other actions that will trigger a DB context to begin tracking an entity or change its state to one of the other enums, added, modified, or deleted. You got a quick look at save changes in the first module. When your code calls save changes, the DB context takes one last look at the entities that you're saving to see if their state information needs to be modified, such as the state enum or the current values. With that info in hand, EF-Core uses the state enum to see if it needs to perform an insert, an update, or a delete in the database. Then it reads the current values and original values from the entity entry and uses its knowledge of how the entity and its properties map to the database table and columns. And with the help of the database provider, it then is able to determine the SQL command that needs to go to the database. Once the SQL is created, it then uses the provider's information and the connection string that you define opens a connection to the database and sends the SQL command that it built. When the database is finished, it'll return a little bit of information back to EF-Core. First, it will let it know the number of records that were affected. And additionally, if you inserted any new rows and the database generated keys for those rows, it will return those key values to the DB context. Then, if needed, the DB context will update the entity's keys and foreign keys to the values created by the database. The last task is to modify the entity entry objects for any of the entities that were sent to the database, resetting their state back to unchanged and their original values to whatever they are now. You've seen me create and insert data into the database a few times. Let's look a bit more closely at that. The most common way to add an object is to use the dbSetAdd method, which is something we've done a few times already. And this is one of those triggers that lets the context be aware of the object. At the same time, because you use the add method, the context sets its state, that is the state property of the entity entry object, to added. The DB context itself also has an add method that's useful in particular scenarios. For example, if you're writing generic code, which may not know which DB set you're working with. In that case, when you pass the object into DB context add, the context will figure out what the type is so that it can create the tracking object with the proper information. There are a few other ways to add data to the context, but they're not relevant to this point in your education. Here I'm creating a new author object, and notice I'm not providing a value for ID because I know the database is going to be doing that for me. When I run this and call add, the ID is still 0. Now let's call save changes. EF-Core sees that the state is added and constructs a T-SQL insert statement with all of the property values except for the ID. Because by default, EF-Core knows the database will be generating those keys, it doesn't need to and shouldn't push those temporary values into the database. And the insert statement is parameterized. The first name and last name were sent in as parameters. All insert, update, and delete commands generated by EF-Core will always be parameterized. But notice something else interesting about the SQL statement. There's an output clause in the T-SQL that says to send back the ID of the inserted row. And this is notable if you've been using EF or EF-Core for a while. This was a big change introduced in EF-Core 7. Since the beginning of Entity Framework, the insert statements always had an additional select to return the new IDs. But now there's only one command to execute, so it's a big performance improvement. Here's the new row in the database, and its ID is 8. That value gets sent back to EF-Core, which then pushes it into the ID property of the author. And look, the author object's ID is also 8. By the way, because this DB context is still in scope, the DB context is still tracking this author. So after it finished executing the command, it fixed up the change tracking object with a new ID value and also reset its state. It's now unchanged. And this is important. If you were to call save changes again, you would not want EF-Core to try to insert that author a second time. But with its state unchanged, save changes will just ignore that entity. The DB context gets disposed along with the tracking objects. So in this particular case, we don't really benefit from that fix-up.